Welcome to RELANZA, the podcast that connects you with expert voices on the most innovative topics in language education. I'm Mercedes Querol from the Universidad Internacional de La Rioja and the coordinator of this space. Don't miss it. RELANZA starts right now.
Hello there. We're back with another episode of our RELANZA podcast. This time we'll be talking about internationalization in the language curriculum. And for this conversation, we have with us Dr. Emma Dafouz from the Complutense University of Madrid. How are you, Emma? Nice to have you here.
Hello, good morning, Dario. Thank you so much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here with you.
The pleasure is ours, Emma. And to start off, so that the audience can also get to know you and your work, tell us 3 things you'd like listeners to know about you.
Well, so the first thing you've already mentioned it is an objective academic fact. I'm a full professor of English linguistics at the Complutense. My teaching and research focus on the role of languages in the internationalization of higher education, with special attention to English medium instruction in multilingual contexts. And I'm also focused on language policies and professional development to improve educational quality in those universities. That's the academic bit. But when I thought about this question, I realized there are 2 other non-academic things worth sharing because they clearly reflect how I approach to my research and teaching. The first is curiosity. I'd say I'm a person interested in a wide range of things because I see connections everywhere, from sustainability and the environment to medicine or history. And I think that cross-disciplinary curiosity feeds into my work. And that's where my big interest in internationalization comes in, in education, globalization, and languages. And the third thing, again, related to this, is I really love music, all kinds of music, from Bach to, Rosalia. You should see my Spotify list, the algorithm goes crazy with me. And I work with choirs, I sing in choirs. And singing in a choir requires teamwork, and that's something I also bring to work. I think we need to find connections between the linguistic, the emotional, and the artistic, and internationalization has that global vision. So, those are the non-academic facts, but, I think they reflect my work.
Thank you so much, Emma. And, surely we could do the next podcast about music. But this one will be about internationalization in the language curriculum. So my first question is, how would you define internationalization in the context of language teaching? And why do you think it's a key element in today's curriculum?
Okay, so internationalization has many faces and many, many labels, but essentially it's about broadening our horizons when it comes to understanding the world, to adopt a perspective that helps us function both in a close local environment and also in an international global one. And this ability to act locally, thinking both globally and locally, is absolutely essential to understand the interconnected world we live in, and to our academic and professional development. And languages play a crucial role in this process of internationalization. They're one of the main mechanisms we have to communicate with others, to build connections, to create meaning. This isn't something new. Humans have been communicated with speakers of other languages and cultures since the beginning of time. What is new, though, is the scale and scope of this educational internationalization. Nowadays, universities, all institutions, companies are adopting strategic approaches to make internationalization something cross-cutting, integrated, so that it's not just a privilege for a few, but something that reaches as many participants as possible. A clear example of this is the fact that the number of students taking part in mobility programs has increased. It's not a huge number, around 10%, depending on where, but it has grown. It's not longer just the elite. The ways of internationalizing have diversified beyond mobility. people now talk, for example, about internationalization at home for those who can't go abroad. There's also internationalization of the curriculum of study programs, an inclusive internationalization aimed at, let's say, reaching a greater number of people from different groups, cultural, linguistic, ethnic, gender, etc. Also responsible internationalization. So in this context, English has become firmly established as a main vehicle for internationalization. It's a lingua franca for communication, and as we well know, most scientific publications, international conferences, networks, mobility programs use English as the common language. And that's also why English holds such a central place in the language curriculum from increasingly early ages. For example, in Spain, English is introduced in early childhood education from 0 to 3 years old. There's also a great deal of exposure to the language outside the classroom. This has increased enormously through social media, the internet, audio-visual media, Netflix. Who doesn't know Netflix? And this has significantly improved students' language competence. This has two impacts or implications. First, the role or communicative functions of English have expanded. So instead of being seen as a foreign language, it has become what I mentioned earlier, a lingua franca used by speakers whose L1 is not English. And in this way, the focus tends to be on the message, on the content, rather than on the form, on grammatical accuracy. All of this is having, or I think should have, an impact on the language curriculum. Let me explain. The student is no longer seen as an eternal learner whose model is the native speaker, but as a competent user who uses English to communicate effectively. And that effectiveness varies depending on the context. Another key aspect linked to internationalization is the shift toward multilingualism. That is, taking into account students' mobility, that exposure to English and other languages outside the classroom, the diversity we now seen in classrooms with learners of many different nationalities and languages, including heritage languages. The ultimate goal is to teach people who are able to operate in those global settings I mentioned earlier to use other languages, other linguistic repertoires that also come into play. Recent research tells us that plurilingual users draw on their different linguistic repertoires in a very creative and valuable way. And so here the key point is that there's a paradigm shift, this shift from the idea of using one language at a time and not, let's say, mixing it with others, is now being reflected in teaching practices that allow for what's known as translanguaging, that blending of languages. And there are studies, again, showing that the pedagogical use of the L1 helps with content comprehension, student interaction, and idea generation. So that kind of Spanglish, which people sometimes talk about in a negative way, is now seen as a resource. Languages don't compete with each other. They collaborate both cognitively and in terms of identity and socially. This can be challenging for foreign language teachers who were perhaps trained within much more prescriptive models. And it's also difficult when English is viewed, for instance, as a cannibal language that devours others,
But perhaps we can come back to that later when we talk about the challenges, Dario.
Yes, absolutely, Emma. Thank you very much. I agree on this point that as we're witnessing and indeed taking part in a paradigm shift, well, this will, of course, have an impact on teacher training, and we'll need to be patient when it comes to putting these changes into practice. And thinking precisely about those changes and about implementation issues, could you share a project or initiative aimed at promoting internationalization in educational institutions? And perhaps what lessons or outcomes would you highlight in relation to teacher training?
Okay, so I was thinking, reflecting on these possible initiatives. there are many, so many, and I'm sure our listeners know or even take part in some of them, But I'm going to focus on the university level, which is the one I know best and have researching in recent years. And here, a really significant shift has taken place. I'll talk briefly about the European University Alliances. There are similar initiatives in other parts of the world, but in Europe, they took shape in 2018. They emerged as an European Union response to this idea of internationalization of education, of university spaces, university systems, and university alliances are strategic supranational groupings formed by different countries, For example, the Complutense, where I work, it's part of an alliance called Una Europa and brings together 11 universities. Imagine what it means to coordinate 11 universities, their curricula, their faculty, the mobility of students, moving from one university to another. And this it's complex from a governance point of view, but of course it's a genuine transformation. I think that's the right word, out of the 11 million university students in Europe, more than half are now part of one of these alliances. There are 570 universities involved across 35 different countries. So just imagine what that represents, It's an absolute change. I think it's the most important change that's taken place in European universities in recent years. From an educational point of view, these alliances, as I said, are a revolution. They're an innovation in the way curricula are created. And I think they also offer a great opportunity for teacher training. From the perspective of that training, I believe these alliances promote multilingual teaching models because, well, there's a language of instruction, which sometimes is English, but not always, as there are very, very varied, very rich language combinations. It also depends on the disciplines, In areas such as law, there are areas, for example, French or Italian, often take precedence over English, depending on, let's say, the legal or educational traditions, etc. Spanish also plays a role. But that's open to debate, and I've written about that topic. So language training is vital. And then more integrated curricula between universities and schools are also being developed through these alliances. This makes it possible to have a language curriculum that's more realistic, more contextualized, as I mentioned earlier, and teacher training that's more closely connected to the real challenges of the classroom and of society. And for example, we now have clear models of collaborative online international learning, online international collaboration at, say, the secondary university level or between universities in other countries, all which once again promote internationalization in a more immediate and more authentic way. There are problems as well, of course. On paper, internationalization may appear to be multilingual, but there are cases, and I've been critical about this, where in practice, English ends up dominating many of these contexts again. But I've also seen that in recent years, these alliances have developed language policies precisely to maintain the languages of their own institutions, So those tensions between English taking the lead and other languages are, let's say, now being acknowledged in those language policies and taken into account when designing degree programs. We still need to work on, as you said, we have to be patient with some of these developments to consider minoritized languages alongside others. But the reality is that these highly international university settings are already here. It's here, and they're a very, very interesting space.
Definitely a very rich topic. And actually, regarding Una Europa, we have, just so our listeners know, I'm at the University of Edinburgh, which is also part of Una Europa.
Yes, of course.
And we have a PhD student working jointly with the Complutense University of Madrid and in practical terms, I'm the go-between, since I can handle both Spanish and English, because you're right, each team tends to work in its own language, and yes, sometimes English tends to dominate the interactions and communications until, for fairness sake, they said, well, let's find, and that's exactly when they come across Dario. So I've been mediating, and you mentioned the challenges, Emma, and the issues that need to be addressed to ensure the success and sustainability of these initiatives. So when we think about internationalization in the language curriculum, what would you say are the main challenges to keep pushing it forward? And how do you think these could be addressed in the future?
Okay, once again, let's say trying to identify just a few challenges from such a broad set is not easy, but well, I'll focus on three that I see as fundamental. And there are certainly more, but these are the ones I've worked with most and I've seen firsthand. I think there's a conceptual challenge, which I've already mentioned, which is to re-examine the concept of language, that languages, how they function in these absolutely international and multilingual contexts, and also to re-examine the methodologies we use. Language teaching in the 21st century can no longer be understood as rigid, separated compartments. Languages aren't isolated entities. They're interrelated systems that coexist in the mind of the multilingual speaker. And this perspective calls for, on the one hand, searching for complementary, not opposing methodologies. For example, instead of setting different approaches against each other, like a communicative approach in English and a very grammar-focused approach in French, I have a student who's just completed her final project, and that's precisely what she observed in the secondary school she analyzed, Well, that's not feasible because in a way it ends up setting methods against each other instead of promoting a flexible pedagogy, one that responds to students' needs and to a much more globalized sociolinguistic context. It also means understanding pedagogical translanguaging, allowing students at certain moments to draw on their full linguistic resources to construct meaning. It's also about finding a balance between English as a foreign language, which pursues native-like models, and English as a lingua franca, a tool for global communication with all its many varieties that students are increasingly exposed to because of all the out-of-school English, or languages and intercultural uses, And then we need to explore this balance in order to train teachers who can teach English as a global means of communication rather than simply as the imitation of a native standard. That said, of course, we mustn't forget that we're in an educational context. That doesn't mean students shouldn't know how to use grammar correctly, verb tenses or order, word order in a sentence, but there should also be moments, as I said, where the focus is on form rather than on content. I think teachers are already doing this through communicative models, but it's about understanding that languages don't compete with each other. They actually serve as mutual support systems. And that brings me to the second challenge. I talked about a conceptual challenge. There's also an organizational one, which I think might be more difficult. It has to do with coordination between departments of foreign languages and the Spanish language department. We need to include Spanish because that's the context I'm in, but I mean the students L1, which sometimes isn't even the language of the country. And that opens up another issue, heritage languages. But well, this requires a shared institutional vision, one that overcomes fragmentation, the traditional fragmentation between departments, the English department, the French or German department, or well, the Spanish department on one side and the foreign language departments on the other. I think that kind of coordination across departments is essential, and it's certainly not an easy task, but it can be done. It can be done, and I've seen it work in many contexts, especially in CLIL, in bilingual education, you know, in secondary schools or primary schools, through interlinguistic projects. For example, communicative tasks developed across different languages, you know, joint teacher training where methodologies enrich one another, or a coherent curriculum design that promotes plurilingualism. And that takes me to the third challenge, the training challenge. How do we train teachers? Well, teacher training, as I mentioned earlier, you know, has to go beyond competence in a foreign language. And this is where it becomes more complex. We need to train plurilingual and intercultural educators, teachers who are able to reflect on their own linguistic ideologies. That's a really, really interesting task, to step outside their methodological and cultural comfort zone and to integrate critical, inclusive, and global perspectives into their teaching practice. How can this be done? Well, as I said, through initial training with a more plurilingual, more critical approach, with ongoing professional development, with spaces for reflection, mutual observation, for example. That's something we don't do in Spain. We don't observe. We don't go into other people's classrooms. It's still kind of taboo. But I think that there are now some examples out there, you know, engage in co-teaching. You know, again, it's about not living in those separate compartments, you know, and then teacher mobility, whether physical or virtual, to broaden horizons and question our assumptions. I really believe that even if it might seem like something very distant, I think it's actually already here. I mean, I teach in English philology, and I already have students whose competence in English is excellent thanks to all those factors we've been talking about. They also have a second foreign language because once their English is well developed, it opens the door to other foreign languages, German, Italian. Some of my students even study Korean at the university.
Wonderful.
They may have their level of competence may vary, you know, but it's there. So, well, I really think that it's not so impossible. And we're not so far from this, let's say, this paradigm shift. I'll stop here, Dario.
Thank you, Emma. It's been a real pleasure talking with you about such a fascinating topic. And we invite our listeners to keep the conversation going and to listen to the other podcasts that are part of this project called RELANZA. Thank you so much, Emma.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
RELANZA is a project funded by the Directorate for Knowledge Transfer at UNIR and developed in collaboration with the Prodigy Research Group and the Language Curriculum SIG of the British Association for Applied Linguistics. Don't forget to visit our website to learn more about this topic and to find ideas for your lessons.